Today's lecture is about the sociologist Erving Goffman's presentation of self in everyday life, an approach to studying human interaction also known as dramaturgy or dramaturgical analysis. Dramaturgy, as seen through the lens of the performing arts, refers to the study of how drama is created and enacted on the stage. To sociologists, dramaturgy is a perspective that draws on parallels with the performing arts to investigate how human beings interact with one another. The fundamental premise of Goffman's dramaturgical approach is that people like you and me who go about our daily business and interact in everyday settings are like actors performing on a stage. On this stage we have something called the front stage, which is the part of the performance that helps us figure out who everyone on stage is, what their role is, where they are, and overall what to expect. To put it in Goffman's terms, it helps us define the situation we seek to enter. The social front stage is comprised of several things. First, just as a stage has various props and items that make up the scene, so every social front occurs within a given setting or context with all the surrounding things that make it up. And as the context or scene changes, so do the expected behaviors and interactions. For instance, we might expect people to dress, behave, place orders for food, and perhaps even act a different way at a fancy restaurant versus a fast food restaurant. Even from the pictures alone, you can probably already guess at the social purpose of the first versus the second. Whereas the first might be a dinner date, the second seems more like a casual lunch with the kids. Second, besides the setting, each performer has what is called their own personal front. This personal front is the same kind of front we refer to when we use the phrase to put up a front, in that our personal front is basically a show that we put on for our audiences, as if we were in a theatrical play. However, since this is also a sociological approach to thinking about dramaturgy, as you may have guessed, even this personal front, which as the name suggests is personal and individual, is also conditioned by social forces that are bigger than just us as individuals. Let's look at two key elements that make up the personal front to show how the personal front is also a social front, in that it is conditioned by broader social factors. These two elements that make up the personal front are our appearance and our manner. Just as an actor on a stage would be dressed and would look a certain way, appearance refers especially to things like our fashion, how well groomed we look, possibly how we maintain things like our hairstyles. This often, but not always, corresponds to the kind of social person we are. By that I mean the way society labels us and expects us to look. For instance, different occupations have different formal or informal dress codes. We expect that a police officer is going to be dressed in a very distinctly different way than, say, a doctor or a nurse. Our expected appearances may also correspond to the setting or context. Depending on where we are, including whether we are at work or not, people around us might expect us to dress differently. Of course, there are always those of us who may want to rebel against the fashion police in our lives, but when we do, we often face certain repercussions. For instance, being punished or at least berated for not being in the proper uniform as a police officer, or for not being formally dressed enough for a black tie event. Appearance may not only be based on things that we take on voluntarily like jobs, however. Gender appearance is one of the hot topics of today when people who believe someone should be able to dress however they like clash with more traditional people who believe that those whom society labels as men should appear a different way than those whom society labels as women. These clashes can revolve around clothing, but in both the past and present have also pertained to other things such as makeup, hair length, and even musculature and body size. A person's personal front also consists of their manner. A person's manner may come across through their visible emotional states, but it could just as easily be in how they carry themselves, for instance, between someone whose manner suggests a confident versus insecure person. Like appearance, there are often social meanings associated with a person's manner. Just as we expected people of different occupations to appear in different ways, we also sometimes expect different mannerisms depending on the person we are interacting with. For instance, we might expect a security officer to come across as serious and stern, while we might expect healthcare personnel or people in other service-related industries to come across as more helpful and warm, which is why it sometimes surprises, if not offends us, when people sometimes have different mannerisms than we expect them to. Now that we've covered some of the elements that make up a dramaturgical perspective, we must also think about why it matters, especially as far as how this perspective can help us understand how and why humans interact in the ways they do. In other words, why does it matter that the setting and personal fronts we see in our day-to-day interactions help, as Goffman says, to define the situation? I will focus here on 3 implications on the idea of the dramaturgical perspective. First, as you may have been able to tell from the discussion about appearances and personal fronts, our interactions and behaviors usually end up reflecting the norms and values of the broader society, what Goffman calls idealization, and that we are upholding the ideals of society. As Goffman notes, our performances tend to incorporate and exemplify the officially accredited values of the society. As our earlier discussion showed, and as anyone can attest, not everyone goes according to what society considers quote-unquote proper and right. There are always those society considers to be deviant, including, but not limited to, those society labels as criminals. Yet, as the example about dress code earlier suggested, to go against the grain of what society considers acceptable usually means facing some kind of negative sanctions. For instance, committing murder will land you in prison and possibly earn you the death sentence, depending on which state you reside in, if you are caught, tried, and found guilty. But negative sanctions can also be much more informal. For instance, swearing loudly and constantly in a public setting may not necessarily be illegal, at least not in all public settings, but will certainly earn you the glares of people around you and possibly a scolding from someone annoyed enough to give you a piece of their mind. What these negative sanctions suggest is that while deviance from what society considers ideal certainly and always exists, by and large the average person will tend to behave and interact in ways that are socially approved. Second, by defining the situation for us, the performances we see on the front stage of everyday interactions make it easy for us to usefully draw on our past experiences to know what to expect and how to respond without having to expend incredible amounts of mental energy to process every single thing that comes our way. As Goffman states, observers need only be familiar with a small and hence manageable vocabulary of fronts and know how to respond to them in order to orient themselves in a wide variety of situations. In other words, because we've been in similar situations before, or at least think we've been in similar situations before, we know how to behave without people giving us weird looks or our interactions failing altogether. If you've only ever been to fast food restaurants in your life, then you may feel quite disoriented at a fine dining restaurant. You may not know, for instance, that you should generally wait to be seated, and that the person who ushers you to your seat is probably not going to be the same person who takes your order. Or take the notion of dating for the first time in your life. The first time you went on a date, you probably were nervous, not knowing what to say, how to react to the other person's behaviors or words, or how to accurately interpret whether they liked you or not. You may have fumbled at the conversation, awkwardly stared too much or too little, or misinterpreted the mood and gone in for what turned out to be an unwelcome kiss. However, go on enough dates, at least in the same culture, and by the third or fourth time you would likely start to take a lot of these initial uncertainties in your stride. Finally, while being better able to define the situation can be useful in that it gives us a sense of predictability and knowledge about how to act and react, Goffman also notes that the pressure to behave in ways that are socially approved also results in another kind of pressure, to make what he calls invisible costs visible. Goffman says that the individual typically infuses his activity with signs which dramatically highlight and portray confirmatory facts that might otherwise remain unapparent or obscure during the interaction. In other words, sometimes working conscientiously at our job doesn't really convey the effort we put into doing our job well to others, and so we sometimes make additional efforts to show people around us, especially our bosses, that we are in fact doing our work diligently. People in the service industry are good examples. If you work as a waiter at a restaurant or a nurse at a hospital, you will likely be given a number of tasks to accomplish during a typical day from your immediate supervisor. Occasionally, you might finish your work early or perhaps just have gotten off your shift. What many in these industries have found is that if you let your guard down and appear like you aren't working, even if you technically are off duty or have done all that was asked of you, it may negatively impact you. If you're a waiter, your manager might give you extra duties if they find you standing idle after finishing all the tasks you were assigned. If you're a nurse and you've just finished your shift, taking a break in full view of the patients, even those who aren't yours, may cause some consternation among them, as they may start thinking that the medical staff in charge of something as vital as a patient's health and life may be shirking, even if that technically isn't true. And so what happens is that people in the service industry often make a show of doing their work just to show that they are actually doing what they are expected to be doing. Waiters might arrange cutlery and menus just to look busy. Nurses might take a look at a patient's medical charts even when they don't need to. People in offices, as the earlier pictures showed, might pretend to be busy at their computers even when the tasks are completed and what they might really want to do is take a nap. Goffman calls this making invisible costs visible because it shows to our audiences, whomever they may be, that we are paying the costs that we are expected to be paying in our various social roles. In summary, we have looked at some of the key points in Erving Goffman's dramaturgical perspective. We have learned that Goffman's basic premise is that people are like actors on a stage. The front, or the front stage of the performance we see in any social interaction, is comprised of both the setting or context and the personal fronts that come from each social actor's person. The personal front in turn is comprised of both an actor's appearance and manner. We also discussed 3 of the social implications of applying the dramaturgical perspective to everyday interactions and behaviors. These are not all that Goffman had to say, but are some of the most prominent. First, our behaviors tend toward a process of idealization, in which we tend to put on performances that society deems acceptable and proper to our social station in life. Second, the fact that this idealization tends to be what most of us adhere to gives us all a sense of predictability in our everyday interactions. Third, one curious outcome of both this idealization and predictability is that many of us at some point or other feel the need to make invisible costs visible, to show our audience, whomever they are, that we are indeed conforming to societal ideals.